Hey everyone, you are listening to the Divergent Conversations podcast. We are two neurodivergent mental health professionals in a neurotypical world. I'm Patrick Casale.
And I'm Dr. Neff.
And during these episodes, we do talk about sensitive subjects, mental health, and there are some conversations that can certainly feel a bit overwhelming. So we do just want to use that disclosure and disclaimer before jumping in. And thanks for listening. Hey everyone, welcome back to Divergent Conversations. Today we have Katy Higgins Lee, an MFT. She is a multiply neurodivergent therapist in private practice in Northern California. She is also a clinical supervisor, continuing education provider, neurodiversity advocate, unschooling parent, gardener, and writer. And we are really excited to have you on here for our Giftedness series that we're doing.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. Yeah, Katy, I've admired your work for a long time. We both like Venn diagrams, and I saw your Venn diagram, which is a massive one and incredible, where you look at ADHD, autism, and giftedness. So I'm really excited to get to have an extended conversation with you. One way we're starting this series is just asking our guests, like, how they come into this conversation. Because for a lot of you, it's been a personal journey into this conversation. So I'm going to start there of kind of what led you to this conversation around giftedness and neurodiversity. How do you enter this conversation?
Yeah, great. So for me, it starts when I was a kid, that I was identified as gifted when I was about 7. And I ended up getting the opportunity to be in a class for 3 years of grade school that was specifically for gifted kids. And that was full time. It wasn't like a pull-out program. It was actually full-time education. And it was an amazing experience. And then had to go back to non-specific gifted education after that. And then, fast forward many years, became a therapist, then had kids, started to see some traits in my kids. And because of that, started looking back into giftedness again. It was something that I'd sort of thought of like, oh, I was gifted when I was a kid, but was that really accurate? Because I don't feel very gifted. And what even is giftedness? Like I just kind of had pushed it aside until I started to see these traits in my kids, started researching it again, and started to recognize how a lot of experiences that I had related to being gifted, and a lot of even like struggles that I'd had related to being gifted. So I decided to do a training that was specifically on working with gifted clients in my therapy practice. And that's through Inner Gifted, which is a really great organization. But within that training context, I was asked if I'd considered I could be autistic also. And at first I completely rejected the idea, because I didn't know anything about autism other than what I'd learned in school, which was very little, and was all in a lot of ways inaccurate, or maybe just missing a lot of information. So I resisted it for a while, but I eventually, after researching a lot, I decided to get assessed. And also around the same time, one of my kids, it was suggested that he could be autistic. So there were a number of assessments that happened, and yes, turns out I'm autistic. And in that assessment, they also said, we think you have ADHD also, which was another big surprise. So because of all that, and I was sort of like in the giftedness community, and a lot of it's revolved around parenting gifted kids, but a lot of it is also, some of it is focused on what it is to be a gifted adult. And then I also kind of dove into the neurodiversity affirming therapy community, and I started to see all of these ideas that were being talked about in each community that were some really big overlaps, and then some things that were complete opposite, especially in the way that giftedness, autism, and ADHD were being discussed. And so I decided, I didn't decide, I just sort of ended up exploring this intersection of these 3 different ways of being neurodivergent, because I do think of giftedness also as being a kind of neurodivergence. And that was how I ended up making the Venn diagram that you mentioned. That was definitely a one-time deal for me. Like whenever people ask me if I would do another Venn diagram about something else, I always just direct them to you, because just doing that one was really and continues to be kind of overwhelming for me, just sort of like having people contact me and want, information about it. And I don't know how you do it because I have a small following and I find that overwhelming. So I don't know how you handle the massive following that you have. But anyway, that's where it kind of came from, is that it was this exploration of these different opinions that people had. And more specifically, it was that in the giftedness community, there's a lot of discussion about, we don't want to misdiagnose kids as autistic or with ADHD when they're actually just gifted. And there's like so much fear around that. But because of that, a lot of people like me get missed. Like maybe our giftedness gets identified, but nothing else does. But then within the neurodiversity affirming therapist community, especially, there was a lot of like, well, giftedness doesn't exist. Giftedness isn't real. People would say things like giftedness is just undiagnosed autism and ADHD. I
didn't know that was out there. So there's an idea in the space that giftedness isn't real.
Yeah. There definitely is. There's a lot of memes I've seen, reels, various things on social media. Some of those Facebook therapist groups. There's been some big arguments that erupted around this, actually. So much so that I ended up creating there's now a separate Facebook therapist group that I created that's specifically for therapists that work with gifted clients.
And is the idea that because of the label gifted is like, a unfortunate label. And so is the idea that using that label is ableist or hierarchical, or like, what's the thinking behind the idea that giftedness isn't real?
Yeah, I think what you just said, like people think that it's ableist or hierarchical. People think that it's just a functioning label. Like I've heard people say it's similar to using the term Asperger's. Because, and this is the other part of it, is that there is a lot of overlap, that just like with all kinds of neurodivergence, when we're neurodivergent in one way, we're very likely to be neurodivergent in other ways as well. And with things like autism and ADHD, many people have just accepted like, now we have. I know it took a while to get there in terms of the diagnosis process, but now, for at least 10 years now, that's been known that it's common to, if you're autistic, it's very likely that you're also an ADHDer, and the reverse also. But for some reason with giftedness, there's this belief that if you're identified as gifted, but then you get diagnosed or self-identify as autistic or an ADHDer later in life, that like negates the giftedness or something. People seem to think that giftedness was a mislabel, is what seems to, and I think part of it is because people look back on, say, like me, like where they were in a gifted class, and they think, oh, well, so many people in that class were autistic or ADHDers, so it must be everybody then, which is not true. It is separate.
So I'm going to jump in with an anecdote here that was kind of an aha moment. So I've been personally loving this series because I've been learning a lot about giftedness through the folks we've been talking to, through the conversations it's led to. And I had this terrible, kind of funny aha moment. So in my family, I'm multiply neurodivergent. My kids are multiply neurodivergent. And we kind of tease my spouse for being this like boring, neurotypical, like cis white guy. But I was like, oh my gosh, I need to stop calling you neurotypical, because he's gifted, but he's not autistic. He's not ADHD. He has incredible executive functioning. So he doesn't relate to the executive functioning struggles. And I've been like, it's kind of breaking my brain a little bit. And so, yes, they do exist. But you're right. And we've had other guests talk about that. There's a lot of overlap between gifted and being autistic, ADHD. But there also are gifted people out there who aren't autistic or ADHD.
Right, exactly. And for some reason, a lot of people resist that idea. Yeah.
Yes. And they resist the idea. I guess because it can be seen as a functioning label. And we talked about this before we started recording. I mentioned how I opened up a conversation thread in my community. And one thing that really struck me was there's a lot of gifted, especially 2E adults, looking for spaces where it feels safe to dive into the complexity of like, this is a complex identity to have. Yes, there's privileges that come with it, but also there's very real hard things. But it can feel, I would imagine. So I don't know if I've shared this with you, Katy, but I'm actually not gifted. But I can imagine if someone is gifted and then complaining about it, it's like, it could feel like someone complaining about their privilege in a way that it's just like, oh no, we're not going to have that conversation. So I just think it's a really complex conversation to have, complex conversation for adults specifically. It can invoke a lot of emotions in ourselves, but also the people around us, as is indicative of kind of the Facebook social media conversation that you're referring to. Why do you think this is such a complex conversation?
Well, I think there's a lot of reasons. I mean, one, like you said, the actual word gifted is problematic.
Do you have, like, if you were renaming it, do you have a name that you would be like, this is what I would name it?
I have not figured out anything that is a better alternative. I mean, I don't like the word gifted at all, but I haven't found anything that actually is better in any way, because it's similar to how I feel about autism and ADHD. Those terms are kind of crappy names in various ways. Like the word autism, if you look at the root of it, it has to do with like almost implying that we're like self-absorbed. And then, because it's like autos, right? And then ADHD, obviously like attention deficit and then even just hyperactivity disorder, right? Like all of those words actually are problematic. So for all of these, I feel like there's no great terms for them. So I often will refer to all three of them as being crappy names for real experiences. But yeah, I haven't come up with anything that's better, and I haven't heard anybody else say anything better. There is one author and therapist, 𝗿𝗶𝘀𝘁𝗶𝗿, who wrote the book My Rainforest Mind. And she talks about the idea of using that term, rainforest mind, as an alternative for giftedness. And some people really like that term. And I do, in certain ways, I like it, but I still don't think it's like a perfect substitution for the word gifted.
I like it as a metaphor, but yeah, I don't really see it being a like, oh, are you a rainforest mind? I'm a rainforest mind. Like,
right.
But
exactly. Yeah. So I think the label, that's one of the problems. So just the word itself. And then I think also because of the ways that giftedness has been misunderstood, like in the same way that autism and ADHD has been misunderstood, that many people think that giftedness means that you are really good at school, and they think that's all it is. And many of us that are gifted aren't really good at school unless we have accommodations for our giftedness. So like for me, the best I ever did in school was when I was in that gifted program, or in graduate school, because I went to a very specific school. It was experiential and very small classes, and it worked for me. So people think that giftedness, though, has to do with being good at school or being like high functioning or something like that, or being high achieving in school. And that's not actually accurate, because giftedness is more of like a difference in the way that we process everything. It's the way that, just like with other kinds of neurodivergence, it's like all encompassing. And it's not, we don't necessarily do well in school or in work environments, because school and most work environments are built and designed for sort of like the majority, right? Mm-hmm. So anyone who's like an outlier in any direction will have a hard time. And that's the case with giftedness. But a lot of people don't understand that. And so what happens is that a lot of kids, when they get identified as gifted, they're then given these really harmful messages like, oh, you have so much potential. Why aren't you living up to that potential? Or even messages like, we need to support gifted people because of their potential contributions to society. Things like that.
Which is kind of like the superpower rhetoric of, because you have these special abilities, therefore we will support your disability. It's that same, like, you have to be exceptional to deserve the accommodations or to deserve inclusion.
Exactly. Yeah. That's exactly it. Yeah. So because of that, though, there's a lot of people that have trauma associated with getting identified as gifted. So I think there's like a massive nervous system response that happens in a lot of people when they hear the word gifted because of so much trauma that happens related to the word.
It just sounds like a lot of pressure. That was one of the, as I've been listening to folks, that's definitely a theme of like the pressure to be like hyper independent, the pressure to be hyper achieving, the pressure to get things and not need support, not need instructions, not need to learn skills, to do well in school, to do well in career. That's clinically in my work. What I've seen a lot is gifted folks who do pretty well in school, but then they hit the workforce, and they kind of crumble. Like it's really, the workforce is really hard, and there's this weight, but you went to this really prestigious college or you did really well. And the disconnect between kind of high intelligence and then really struggling, I see that be a source of suffering and struggle for a lot of folks.
Yeah. Yes, definitely. I think that is very common, that like whether someone does well in school or doesn't do well in school, there will be a struggle that comes with that at some point. Especially like another thing that is talked about, Matt Zakrzewski. I don't know if you know who he is. He's a psychologist.
We had him on last week.
Oh, great. Okay. Did you talk about the performance cliff, that idea?
He mentioned it briefly, but he didn't like go into much detail.
Okay. Yeah. I just find that concept, I'm pretty sure he kind of coined that phrase, but I find that, I mean, I definitely recognized it, but having a phrase to describe it was very helpful to me. Just this idea that we will, when you're gifted, very often school and learning something can be a little bit quicker for us to a certain point. And then we hit this cliff and then we just fall off of it. And then we just do, I mean, a lot of times like horribly at that thing. And so some people, it might be like what you're describing, like they get all the way through school and then get into their career and then have that happen. And then for others of us, it can happen much sooner. Like for me with math, it happened in like 5th grade. Like I hit that like I was in a gifted class, but I also needed a math tutor because things had been easy for me up to that point with math. And then suddenly I actually had to work at it and I didn't know how to work at it. And that's the idea with this performance cliff, is like, because we haven't developed the capacity or like the tolerance for the learning process, we don't know how to learn then. So once we get to a point where it's not just easy, we don't know what to do and we just sort of fall apart.
I could imagine that a natural response would be to shut down when you hit that.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I think that's very common. Yeah. Yeah.
I was going to say that was definitely my response was to shut down when things no longer came naturally or easily to me. And then we talked about this in previous episodes, but just not having a good foundation in terms of how to apply certain things or accommodate myself, because everything came so easily and so naturally. And then as soon as I hit that performance cliff, it was like, holy shit, I really don't know how to do school or do work or do any of the things that had been coming so naturally in the first place. Creates this like shame spiral and then this really intense struggle with your sense of self as well.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. It can be very confusing. And just like with other kinds of neurodivergence, that's where I feel like having, again, these words, these labels, these concepts to understand what's happening can make such a big difference. And that's where like identifying giftedness at any age can be helpful if you have the right, what's the word I'm looking for? Like background or like the information to go with it, I guess, the right environment, the right support to go with it. But in any environment, any label of neurodivergence can be harmful or helpful, depending on how much support there is to go with it.
Mm-hmm.
And also on that, oh, sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Oh, just on that point, I wanted to mention something else, that like there are a lot of people that are gifted that don't get identified as gifted. And that's another thing that like a lot of the clients that I've seen actually have been people who came to see me because they figured out they were gifted as an adult. in various ways. And then they realized that having a therapist that understood giftedness would be helpful for them. And just that a lot of people that didn't get identified as gifted still struggle with the same things in childhood and in, as they're getting into adulthood, they still struggle with a lot of those same things that people that were identified as gifted struggle with. So in that way, it just seems important to recognize that the label, many people attribute their sort of like gifted trauma to the label, whereas they probably would have struggled in not the exact same ways, but very similar ways, even if they hadn't had the label.
Right. So, okay, I'm curious because I feel like I have a pretty good sense of what it looks like to unpack the autism label and late in life identification of that. And it amazes me how there's often common themes that come with that. So I'm curious if you've seen some themes similar with giftedness as you're unpacking that with adults. Are there common themes that come up? Are there common like insights or aha moments of like, you mean I'm not like with autism, like, you mean I'm not like broken, I'm not overly sensitive. It's like there's a name for this thing. Are there some kind of core themes that you see often come up for folks when they're newly unpacking this identity?
Yeah, definitely. Let's see. I mean, some of them are understanding, again, like some of the labels that were put on them that other than gifted. So like the labels like teacher's pet or know-it-all or things like that. Let's see. Then also things like recognizing why they didn't feel satisfied in various environments. So that could be like a relationship or school or a career, recognizing why it didn't work for them, because sometimes people that are gifted will do well in a certain career, but be so dissatisfied that they end up leaving that career. And other people around them were like, why did you do that? You were making a ton of money. You were like, seemed like it was working for you. You were like moving up in that career. Why did you leave it? And there's this oftentimes like not being able to identify what is it? Why did I need to leave that job? And oftentimes it's because there wasn't enough intellectual stimulation and enough like complexity to what they were needing to do. And also not having mirroring of their experience, because that can be really like, again, like with any kind of neurodivergence, to have really any identity, right? Like not just neurodivergence, because that could be like gender identity or sexuality or ethnicity or race. Like having that mirroring can be so important. And in various environments, gifted people won't have that. And so then they won't feel comfortable, won't feel that mirroring. And so they'll end up feeling like they need to leave, but not understanding the reason why for that. And that leads into another one of like, this is similar to how people often will talk about other kinds of neurodivergence, but with giftedness, there's often a need to understand why. So like in school or in a career where when they're told, okay, this is the formula for doing this math problem, there's this like, well, but why? Like, I need to know all of the reasons why that you came to that conclusion that that's what we need to do. Or needing to understand like the etymology of words.
And that
like
can feel exasperating for the folks around the person, which then that's what gets mirrored back to them is your questions are exasperating or,
Right.
And I imagine there's so many internal narratives that come on around that, like I'm too much or I'm like stressful for people to be around.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And along with that is like just asking more questions in general. And like, so, and then the masking that can come with that, right? Like, as we talk a lot about autistic masking and even ADHD masking, but with giftedness, there's definitely masking that occurs. And that's part of what a lot of clients will end up working on is not like, because a lot of my clients will be similar to me, like some combination of gifted, autistic, ADHD. And so a lot of what will be worked on is exploring masking, but specifically the giftedness masking is there too. And
so sorry, no, go ahead.
I was just going to give an example real quick. Like in school, not asking the questions as a way of masking, and pretending to
Okay.
not know the answer even sometimes when they
Yes.
do know the answer. Using smaller words than what they actually would want to use because they don't want people to perceive them to be a certain way, and they just want to fit in with everybody else.
Yeah. So I was going to ask, because I used that word, I think, on one of the episodes, but I didn't know if it was a thing. But I was just like, I would imagine gifted people mask. So I was curious kind of what you would conceptualize the core features. So yeah, pretending not to know something, not commenting when you do know something, using different words. Are there other themes to gifted masking? And now I'm like picturing like a diagram, of course, because my brain is like,
Right. Right. Yeah. Let's see. I'm trying to think of some other examples. Well, I mean, depending on the context, sometimes again, it depends on if we've been labeled gifted or if we're in certain environment, like being in a gifted class, for example, where we're expected to be kind of, quote, good at everything, but we're not. And so then there's in some ways like an increased need to mask when we don't know, because it's almost like it doesn't feel acceptable to ask for clarification, because when we do, there's this like, oh, but you should know that you're gifted, you're so smart, or whatever, various phrases people use.
That's got to be so complex and sometimes I'm going to mask and pretend like I don't know something. And in other situations, I'm going to mask and pretend I totally got this when I don't. So you're always masking your true kind of competence in an environment and then therefore your needs. I guess that's another, like, you're masking your needs. You're masking like, I need support to understand this, or I need more intellectual stimulation. I could also imagine like masking interest, because I would think it could be common for a gifted person to be bored, especially if they're also ADHD a lot. So I could also imagine kind of it being in a conversation and masking like, this is a really interesting conversation, when like actually maybe it's not. So a lot of masking of like kind of needs and how you're actually experiencing a moment.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's a great way to describe it. And that's one of the, like, there are all of these different definitions of giftedness, and I don't feel like any of them are perfect. And so I often will describe giftedness in terms of needs instead, because I find that usually it's easier for people to understand when we talk about what gifted needs are. Things like I was saying, like need for intellectual stimulation and complexity, needing to understand the why of things, needing to ask a lot of questions, needing for it to be okay for us to not know the answers to everything, though. In the learning process, there's a need to increase in complexity as soon as we understand a basic concept, as opposed to needing a whole bunch of repetitions for most things. Like that's again, for me, math has always been a struggle. So I did need lots of repetitions with that, and I needed one-on-one. But most other things, I needed to hear the basic concept and then to be able to skip ahead to something much more advanced, because otherwise my attention just completely goes away and I can't focus on it, which is the intersection with ADHD coming in too. And that's, I don't remember the exact number, but there's like research about how many repetitions most people need to learn a concept versus how many repetitions most gifted people need to learn a concept. And what happens is that when the complexity doesn't increase, that oftentimes either students in school or adults in jobs will just lose interest and stop pursuing whatever the thing is. Like I've seen that with like musical instruments, where like if the teacher is like, well, I need you to learn this step by step by step, the student will be like, okay, I'm done, after they've been super into the instrument. And then they're like, well, this is just too boring because you're making me go through these things that I already get it. I don't need to repeat that same exercise over and over again because I already get that, which I know with instruments, there's like, the physical part of it too. But in terms of understanding the like cognitive part of it, that we need to be able to skip ahead most of the time. But it also, there has to be that understanding that sometimes we won't. And so it can be very confusing because of those times when we don't need to skip ahead. We need to actually go step by step. And that's because of the asynchronous development or the like spiky profiles that we often have.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing as you're talking, one thing that's hitting me is like how difficult it would be to regulate attention, especially in a traditional classroom as a gift, especially a gifted ADHD student, because I would imagine, there is a lot of repetition in school, or there's a lot of like, waiting, just being in a classroom. You're often just waiting for things. And to know like, when can I check in and when can I check out? Because I would think there's a lot of periods where you can pretty much check out, like if there's a lot of repetitions happening. But then there might be a critical part where it's actually really important to check in because they're teaching a skill that you don't yet have. So I'm just thinking about how difficult that would be to gauge like attention really of, is this a time where I'm checking out to entertain myself with my own ideas because I'm bored, or where I'm checking in because I need the instruction and the support?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think that you described that really well. And then that can also happen in other environments also, like in a job or even in a social situation, where like a group conversation, and if the conversation goes to something that is like small talk, which I know it's not just gifted people that don't like small talk, right? Like that's talked about a lot within other neurodivergent communities. But when that happens, or when someone's talking about something that to them seems just like it's just, there isn't much complexity to it, that there's a tendency then, or there can be, to kind of like check out and like go do something else, either actually walking away or just letting their mind go somewhere else. And that's where there are people that are gifted, but they get misdiagnosed as ADHD. Like that does happen. But oftentimes it's like me, where it's that we're actually both. And so, there's like an interplay that happens there.
I remember that in my training, kind of looking at profiles in some of my assessment classes. And it was like, this is why this person would look ADHD, because they're gifted, because they're like, yeah, they're getting bored, they're tuning out. But also maybe it's both.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to mention, because you mentioned how in your community, people were asking about spaces, like safe spaces for being able to discuss giftedness. And there are some cool spaces that have kind of come about, like Facebook groups that are specifically for people that are gifted. I personally prefer the ones that specify that they're for like gifted and 2E. So, and you probably in previous episodes defined 2E, but I'm just going to do it anyway, just in case. Like, 2E is twice exceptional, which is gifted plus disabled. Some people will be more specific and say gifted plus like a learning disability, or like some people will even be more specific and say gifted plus autistic or gifted plus ADHD. But I really prefer to be more inclusive of all disabilities, so including physical disabilities, because that I think is really important to recognize what that looks like for people when they have a physical disability and then they're gifted. So they're in, say, like, special education program at school, but they're also gifted, and how that gets navigated.
That's something Dr. Mike brought up, is that that's a population that often goes under-recognized. The people with physical disabilities often get under-recognized as gifted, which I thought was really interesting, and also makes intuitive sense as to why that might be happening.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, I prefer the communities that specifically specify that they they're looking at twice exceptionality and giftedness within the community. But like I mentioned before, Intergifted is an organization, and they have a community that I really appreciate. And again, part of the reason I appreciate it is because they're very aware of other kinds of neurodivergence also. And then specifically for people that are Black and gifted, there's a community that's Our Wild Minds that seems pretty cool. I'm not Black, but people that I know that are in that group have said how it's been really supportive to be able to have a group where they can have their race and their giftedness mirrored, and to get that community. And then the other thing I wanted to mention too, as a resource, is the podcast, I Must Be Buggin'. I don't know if you know that podcast.
No, but I love the name.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's specifically it's like geared towards people that are Black and gifted, but also just neurodivergent in other ways also.
That's fantastic. Thank you for those. Yeah, we'll provide links to that. I love resource curation. So those all sound like very fantastic resources. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, I'm trying to figure out where to go in our conversation because I can tell there's a wealth of information. And well, okay, here's one. Boredom, that came up as a question around both boredom and self-care. I'll maybe put those together because I think that can be like how kind of the idea of giftedness and overexcitabilities. And we know from past conversations the idea of overexcitabilities that also has mixed views. But how boredom factors into the experience of being gifted, but then also like how, if you've noticed, like does self-care differ in how gifted people maybe need to approach that?
Yeah, totally. Okay, so where to start with that? So I'm glad you brought up overexcitabilities because I like that model, but I don't like associating it specifically with giftedness. So the way I see it is that overexcitabilities are something that neurodivergent people in general experience. And I feel like I should explain what overexcitabilities are too. Like,
yeah, if you want to offer a brief, a brief explanation of that,
okay,
yeah, that'd be fantastic.
Okay, cool. So overexcitabilities is a term that is one part of the theory of positive disintegration. And the theory of positive disintegration was something that was proposed and kind of like theorized by Kazimierz 𝗿𝗶𝘀𝘁𝗍, who was a Polish psychiatrist and psychologist, 1900s. Like I think he died somewhere around the 80s or 90s. I don't remember exactly. But he had this theory that I'm a little bit obsessed with. I hesitate to use the word obsessed because I always think about OCD and don't want to use the word obsessed. So I'm not going to say obsessed. It's one of my special interests, I should say. It's more like, it's a better way to describe it. So theory of positive disintegration is this theory. It's this idea that certain people go through these transformations at different points in their life. And not everybody goes through these. But they are these processes where there's this like breaking down of parts of ourself, this like disintegration that happens, but it's in service of like a reforming or a reintegrating in kind of a different form. Kind of the metaphor I like is like a Lego house, where you have this Lego house and then you like take it all apart and then put it back together in a new way. And you might put some pieces in that weren't there before, and you might remove some pieces. But it's this big transformational process that can happen. And it can look like a mental health crisis, and it actually can be a mental health crisis for some people. But if you have the right support, it's possible to come through it and have it be a source of growth and transformation. So overexcitabilities, where that comes in, is that 𝗿𝗶𝘀𝘁𝗍 said that people who possess overexcitabilities are more likely to go through this process of transformation. And overexcitabilities are an increased like sensitivity and intensity in 5 areas of experience. And those 5 areas are imaginational, emotional, psychomotor, sensual. Wait, did I miss one? Oh, and intellectual. That's the 5th one. And so if you think about it, people who are autistic and ADHDers and gifted and even like OCD and some other kinds of neurodivergence even are more likely to have these overexcitabilities. So the reason though that this has been tied to giftedness was in like the 90s, there was this movement in gifted education of people believing that overexcitabilities equaled giftedness, and they didn't look at it as being related to autism or ADHD or anything else. And so people even would like they would identify giftedness based on having overexcitabilities.
Oh, yikes.
Yeah, exactly.
That seems like a really good way to miss a lot of autistic and ADHD people.
Exactly. That's exactly it. And that's the problem with that. So that was the belief for a long time, though, was that 𝗿𝗶𝘀𝘁𝗍 was talking about gifted people, even though he didn't use that word as far as I know. More recently, though, there have been some translations of some of his work from Polish that make it pretty clear that he was actually describing autism and ADHD and other kinds of neurodivergence and giftedness. But that is not as well known yet because it's like brand new. There's only been a couple of papers written on it so far. So all of that is to explain overexcitabilities. And I do think overexcitabilities can be useful though. And I use them in my work with clients in exploring needs and like you're saying, like preventing boredom and like just meeting the needs that we have for giftedness, but also for autism and ADHD. So looking at, for each individual, which areas do we have overexcitabilities? For some people, they have all 5. Some people will just have 1 or 2. And looking at these areas as like areas of needs. So like a need for input in these areas, but also increased sensitivity in these areas. So in the same way that like with sensory needs for being autistic, we have to avoid certain sensory input, but we also really need certain sensory input in order to tend to our nervous systems and just our kind of systems in general. So I think of it that way with all of these areas though. So sensual kind of corresponds with sensory, but then in terms of intellectual, imaginational, psychomotor, I don't know which one I missed right there. It's always hard to remember to say all 5 when I say them.
It is. It's a mouthful.
Yeah, but basically like we have needs for input in those areas if we have an overexcitability. And so I find that helpful to look at when we're feeling understimulated, to look at which areas are we not getting enough input in. And so like with different jobs even. So like for me as a therapist, my sensory needs get met much more now that I know that I'm autistic because I can stim. Like I have my 𝗿𝗶𝘀𝘁𝗶𝗿 here that I'm like stimming with as I sit here. But like psychomotor, like my need for movement, I get a little bit of it, but not quite enough being a therapist. But I definitely get my other needs met, like emotional and imaginational and intellectual. I definitely do. But it also depends on what's happening in the therapy. So like for me personally, there have been times where I was trying to do kinds of therapy like earlier in my career that definitely didn't meet my intellectual needs or my imaginational needs. And so that made it much more difficult for me to like show up in my work. So that's the way that I like to look at it, is to make sure that we're getting, like, figure out which overexcitabilities we have and then make sure that we're getting our input in those areas. And again, also avoiding things that might be overwhelming in those various areas. And then the last thing I'm going to say too is that there's those 5 overexcitabilities, but some people talk about a 6th being like existential. And that's a really big one for people that are gifted, that's a lot of like when gifted clients come to therapy, a lot of what they're needing is mirroring and support for their existential needs that they are not getting in their daily life.
I don't think I've heard that before, existential needs. I love that. I always talk about like being existential or having lots of existential questions, but I love that idea of like, I have existential needs. And I think that makes sense, that would be one way of adapting therapy, would be being able to mirror that those questions are valid and also a place to have those existential needs met. That's really powerful. So I really love how you connected overexcitabilities to self-care. So someone who works for me, I love this metaphor. She's very creative. She's an artist. And something that she shared once was that she sees her overexcitabilities as like these little pets, and she has to feed them each day. And if she doesn't feed them, then like she feels it, she's struggling. But I love that idea of like these overexcitabilities as these like cute little pets that we feed and we nurture and we care for. And that's how we care for ourselves. And you're right. Sometimes that means also like with sensory stuff, that's tricky. It's like less of that sensory input, but more of that sensory input. But I definitely feel that too. And that's interesting about the origin of overexcitabilities, because I would say I relate to overexcitabilities more so than my spouse, me being autistic, ADHD, but not gifted, and my spouse being gifted, but not autistic or ADHD. So I like how you're teasing that out. And that makes more intuitive sense to me, because I'm like, wait, overexcitabilities, like I've got all of those. And so I like broadening that as a framework. And I just think it could be helpful for a lot of neurodivergent folks who are gifted, but also those of us who aren't gifted.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And I love that, what you just named, that idea of like the overexcitabilities as like pets that need to be fed. That is beautiful. I really like that. Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things like that I find helpful about this too is that, again, these positive disintegration processes that we're more likely to go through, that often will happen when we get identified as neurodivergent in adulthood, especially, is how I've seen it. So I've seen it happen, and I experienced it with my autism and ADHD diagnosis, but I've seen it happen for clients with a giftedness identification in adulthood too. That like that process of learning that new information about themselves will catapult them into this process that like in the end ends up to be most of the time very positive, but there's this like really intense process that they'll go through in order to get there, of like just struggling with like who they are and what their identity is. And so understanding the positive disintegration process and overexcitabilities within that, I find really useful, like in combination.
Oh my goodness. I love that. I'm having so many associations right now because I say it in a much more clumsy way, but I often talk about how like once you have this identity discovery, and we've talked about in other episodes how it could be a queer discovery identity, or it could be an autism one, how it kind of opens the door. And I say it's like all identities are back on the table for exploration. So I love the framework of to integrate, we have to disintegrate. So that's such a helpful framework for the late in life identity discovery, whatever the identity is that it often leads to a season of disintegration, which can feel really ungrounded. It can feel really destabilizing. I know I bumped up my therapy to twice weekly during that first 9 months or year of discovery because there was so much I was processing. And that is such a helpful framework for that season. Thank you for that.
Yeah, totally. Totally. That's been something that I've been really like wanting to share. I've been sharing about it for a number of years now since I went through it. And I mean, and I still continue to go through it because that's the thing, is it's not like we go through it and then we're just done. Like there can be these like mini disintegrations that can happen over time. But I presented on that there's a conference on 𝗿𝗶𝘀𝘁𝗋 and on positive disintegration. So I presented on that concept in July. And that video will be available, I'm pretty sure, in January on YouTube to watch, where I talk about this in a little more depth of kind of like specific aspects of a positive disintegration process and how they fit within like discovery or identification of neurodivergence later in life.
I am so excited to like find that and watch that. Oh my goodness. Yeah, I love that as a framework. That's so helpful. I've been saying for a while, like we need identity frameworks for neurodivergence in general, but also the discovery process. I feel like you're building a really solid framework there.
Thanks. Yeah. I also, I know we only have a few more minutes, but I just wanted to say that like another way to frame it is through like a hero's journey process. I find that useful also. Like for some people, that's easier to understand, just the hero's journey being the like structure of the story that so many, or pretty much all stories in all cultures follow, that process being like a psychological process, and that the discovery of neurodivergence can also fit within that process. That was another diagram that I created. I'm a fan of the diagrams too. So
I can, sorry, just in talking to you, I can tell why gifted clients would appreciate you. Like you have so much rich theory and ideation that you bring to the experience. And I think that is part of what can be so helpful for gifted folks and neurodivergent folks in therapy, is that kind of co-creating of metaphor and building of language that's sophisticated and interesting and helpful.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I feel like the phrase pick your brain is always just so weird to me because I think in visuals and I then have a visual of like actually picking your brain. But I feel like I could pick your brain, but not literally for so long. But I also know that you've got to head out here. I know that you have some offerings. Like I think I saw that you have some CE trainings even on on your website, where can folks find you? Are there kind of resources you have to share with people?
Yeah, totally. Thank you for asking. So my website is just my name, KatyHigginsLee.com, and Katy is spelled with a Y, so Katy. There I do have a link to a continuing education course for therapists. It's the one that I have right now is specifically on working with autistic clients. It's a 5-hour on-demand continuing education course. I probably at some point will do a training on giftedness, but I usually just recommend people go to Inner Gifted because their training is really great. It's really in-depth though. It's like a 6-month training. And a little pricey for some people. I mean, it was totally worth it to me, but I think it's not accessible for some people. And so at some point I will probably do like a shorter couple-hour course on giftedness. But my website would be the place to find that. And you could also get on my mailing list to find out about that whenever I offer it. And then I also, most likely in January, will be offering a group for therapists, for neurodivergent therapists specifically, and it would be an authentic movement group. And I won't go into that right now, what authentic movement is, but it's a movement practice. It can be done as a therapy, but it also can be done just as a practice in a non-therapeutic way, which is what I'm planning to do for this group. So again, my website will have information about that. And then just social media that I am tending paths on Instagram and Facebook and TikTok, although I very rarely post on TikTok anymore, but mainly Instagram is the main place to find me.
Fantastic. And we'll provide links for all of that in the show notes.
Yeah.
I was just going to say what you were saying, and my thoughts were coming out of my mouth as you had already said them. So I was just like, that's how slow moving my brain is right now. But I really appreciate this conversation, Katy, because I learned a lot, and I've really enjoyed this series quite a bit, Megan. So thanks for encouraging it for sure.
Yeah. Thanks so much for coming on. And I know you are very busy, so thank you for the generosity of your time with us.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm a fan of your podcast and your work in general, so I'm honored to be invited. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, when I mentioned I opened that thread in my community and people were sharing a lot of stuff and people kept referencing you, and I was like, oh, don't worry, like she's coming on our podcast, and folks were really excited. So
that's great.
I know that your work is really having an impact out there, and I really appreciate what you bring to the conversation.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's going to come out in a couple weeks, so everyone listening, be prepared. We have this episode coming out, and Katy will send this to you too. Share it on your Instagram and share it around. And thank you so much for coming on and making the time. And really, really appreciate you fitting into this very small window that we offered you. And to everyone,
are we supposed to say, oh, I know Patrick's moving slow, and I'm like, I'm going to do the sign off.
Oh, please do. I always love when you do, because then we can.
If you like this podcast, go like it. That helps us. We're on YouTube. Yeah, I think, Patrick, you should do it.
Perfect. Yeah, so mirroring what Megan and Anna just said, if you like this podcast, we think you should like it and find it on YouTube and all major podcast platforms on Fridays. Thanks. Goodbye.